But when we would see normal production of stool, relatively normal smell, and a more regularity of the bowel movements, that's how I knew he was starting to get better.
I'm Dr. Robynne Chutkan, gastroenterologist, microbiome expert, and author, and I am here to help you find gut bliss. On today's show, we're continuing the series about the gut-brain connection, and specifically, could what is going on in the gut be affecting what is going on in the brain? And I'm so delighted to have my friend and colleague. He's a physician, he's a surgeon. I've literally known him since childhood, and he's going to be sharing his experience with autism spectrum disorder, which is really personal. And tell us why it's so personal.
First of all, thank you very much, Robynne, or Dr. Chutkan, for having me here. I have a son, my firstborn son, who is autistic. He was diagnosed at age 3. He's now 20 years old, and we have been taking care of him, of course, all his life, ever since his diagnosis. He has a diagnosis of a regressive form of autism, which means that a child who showed initial normal signs of development only to go backwards instead of forwards in their early toddler years. He is non-speaking, which is the term we use now. We don't say nonverbal anymore. And he types to communicate.
I've been watching from afar, quite frankly. You and I have known each other since we were children, and then we ended up at Columbia Medical School together. We ended up practicing in the same city. And I remember when you first started on this journey, and it has been incredible to watch sort of from afar. Your wife is also a physician, and what the two of you have done is just incredible. But I want to start really from the beginning. And I want to also point out that diseases like autism spectrum disorder, like autoimmune diseases, they are complex. They are multifactorial. There's often no one smoking gun. So what we're going to be exploring on today's episode is the gut-brain connection as you have experienced it. But I just want to make sure that people understand that in no way am I trying to say that the gut is responsible for autism and healing the gut is the only way to approach this disease. But I think your insight over the last 2 decades is just invaluable. So can you take us back a little bit with your son for when he first started to develop symptoms?
So he was born with normal APGAR scores, which means that when he came out of the womb, he appeared, by all intents and purposes, to be a completely normal child. The first signs that we saw that maybe there was something a little bit wrong was in terms of language development. When he went through his first year, he was never combining words. He had single words. And so, of course, we did what a lot of parents do, which started teaching him baby sign language, which is a variation of ASL, American Sign Language. Shortly after his second birthday, however, we noticed quite a few things. There were some inability to hold joint attention. He wouldn't respond to his name. He was hyperactive. He wasn't sleeping, sometimes having night sweats and so forth. And this is when we knew that we had a little bit of an issue on our hands. And then, of course, comes the gut issues. He never progressed from having liquid stools to normal formed stools as a child should progress. His stools were also very runny. They were rancid. They were yeasty. They were foul. And of course, we're talking about the gut, so I can say some of these things on your podcast. And that's how we knew we had a problem. So we finally got a diagnosis when he was about 3 years old.
And I really want to hone in on that point about the stools, because I'm a gastroenterologist. So I'll tell you, nobody's stool smells fantastic, right? It's not supposed to smell great. But it is very clear when something is off with the stool. I mean, if I walk into the emergency room, for example, and somebody has rotavirus, I can smell it from across the room. It has a rotten egg smell. Blood in the stool, melena, that tarry black stool smells horrendous. So what your stool smells like is an important clue that something is off. And usually something is off with the gut microbiome because stool, large part, is dead bacteria, right? So that's a sign that something was going on. And you mentioned that the stools were loose, they were liquid, they were foul smelling. How did you interpret that?
So, of course, your stool is reflective of your diet. And at the time, he had just come off breast milk and formula and so forth, and we were starting him on solid foods. Initially, we were just like, okay, there are certain foods that just don't agree with him. But as the problem persisted and did not seem to be getting any better, we figured that there was something more complicated going on with his GI tract. And he also seemed to be in pain a lot of the time as well. And some parents may notice that with their children as well. And that's how we knew that that was a specific issue. When we finally got the diagnosis, we moved fairly aggressively to adjust his diet to remove certain things such as dairy, wheat, and gluten.
And coming up, we're going to dive into some of those dietary changes. What happened when you changed his diet, not just with his stools, but with other things that were going on in his body. The Gut Bliss podcast is brought to you by VisBiome, my first and quite frankly, my only choice for a probiotic. Whether you're dealing with irritable bowel syndrome or just looking to restore your gut health, VisBiome can help. It's a medical food for the dietary management of IBS and gut inflammation. Backed by science and clinically vetted by thousands of my own patients. Find your gut bliss with VisBiome. Go to visbiome.com/gutbliss and use discount code GUTBLISS at checkout. Okay, we're back with my friend and colleague who is a physician and a surgeon and the father of a son with autism. And so tell us a little bit more about diet-wise what you did.
Okay, so once we got the diagnosis, of course, we delved into a lot of research. We spoke to certain doctors and colleagues. We were told that, autistics tend to have a problem digesting certain foods rich in casein, foods rich in gluten, and of course, sugar also creates a problem. Casein is milk protein, and it comes mostly from dairy sources. Gluten is ubiquitous, especially here in the United States, with a lot of the foods, they include gluten. Some of the things you didn't think would include it have it in there.
You were actually getting that direction from the medical community. This wasn't what you and your wife were researching. You were the doctors who were taking care of your son were telling you high sugar, gluten, dairy, these are the things to watch out for?
So full disclosure, my wife is an integrative medical practitioner. So she was way ahead of the game in terms of researching on her own and reaching out to colleagues across the country about this particular problem. So she was getting most of the information with regards to diet. Some people may hear from my accent, I'm from Jamaica, I'm from the Caribbean originally. We have real foods down there. We don't have as much food processing. So I had always said that we should clean up the diet of the child to see if that would help him. So it was a combination of the two. My wife did a lot of research on it, and we went on it fairly aggressively. And the differences were dramatic. When we pulled certain things from his diet, his behavior, his hyperactivity, his sleep patterns would improve. But the stools continued to be a problem. And as I was explaining, it took several years for the stool to normalize and for his gut to heal. And so anyone who's listening to this podcast, don't think that if you change a diet, like overnight, you're going to see a change. It's going to take a while. Of course, every patient is different.
No, I think that's such an important point. And there are situations where a dietary change can clear things up quickly. We're just on the heels of my gut skin series, and I talked about eczema and rosacea, et cetera. And for some patients with eczema, for my husband, 2 weeks of eliminating gluten, his eczema really started to heal. But when we're talking about a disease as complex as autism spectrum disorder, and we're talking about neuroinflammation in the brain, that is typically not something that is going to, dramatically improve in 2 weeks. And I think that's such an important point. So we're really talking about a decade here, right? Several years.
Yes. As I've coined a term for myself, complex food allergies, which are food sensitivities, which are having not only effects on the motility of the gut and the production of normal stools, but also on behavior, as well as sleep patterns, the ability to focus on things. Anytime that somebody is intoxicated with whatever toxin, it's going to take a while to eliminate it from the body. And each patient is going to do it at their own pace. Children, of course, nowadays, a lot of them are very hyperactive. A lot of them refuse to take certain diets. A lot of them refuse to change their food, and it can become a challenge for the parent.
It's a huge challenge. And, we've talked about food avoidance syndrome. Part of that is because diet is still the factor that has the most profound impact on the gut microbiome. And so when you've been feeding a population of bacteria certain food and you're trying to change what's going on in the gut microbiome, you have to change a food. And so without changing the food, that population is going to continue to grow. And as we were discussing earlier, that population drives the person in search of that very food. I mean, we see it with sugar. I mean, yes, there's, you get that dopamine hit, et cetera, but you also increase the population of the sugar-eating organisms in your gut, and they send you in search of more sugar. I mean, we know that gut bacteria can change the palate, they can adjust the gut motility, so they can really drive behavior. And, the point you made, it can become this vicious cycle where the very food that's causing the problem is a food that they're seeking out and they're craving. So for people listening, were there any tips that you found as parents with getting your son to accept, the vegetables, the foods that maybe are not as sweet and were less palatable to him in some way?
So we were very lucky. Our son loved food. He would eat just about anything. There were only a handful of items that he didn't like because of the texture. So I know a lot of parents struggle because their kids will only eat one thing. So luckily for us, when we started adjusting the diet and removing certain things from his food chain, he didn't really rebel that badly. He would eat pretty much whatever we gave him. And I know, however, for certain families, it's almost an impossible task. If they try to change the food, the child melts down, or they won't eat at all. It becomes very stressful, and it raises the tension level in the home. But we did the adjustments we had to do, and he, luckily for us, adjusted. But I want to make it clear that even when he adjusted, it still took years for his gut to really heal, for his stools to become more typical or normal, and for his eczema and his skin conditions to fully clear up and his cognition to improve.
So when did he develop the eczema? Was that part of the initial diagnosis?
Yes. We noticed that in the inside of his arms, he would have rashes that he would scratch, and it would be so bad he would bleed. His brother also developed a similar situation, even though his brother is classified as neurotypical. So yes, we saw wicked rashes on him, especially in the arm areas and sometimes the groin. And it was part of the whole initial assessment. I just want to make this clear, though. Even though we're both physicians and went to fancy Ivy League schools and all this kind of stuff, we panicked just like every other parent would panic when you're told that something is wrong with your child. So yes, we bought plane tickets and flew around the country. And yes, we listened to all kinds of stuff on the internet. And we did all of the things. We ran up huge amounts of money on treatments we weren't sure were going to work. So, I come on here on your podcast and sound kind of controlled and everything, but we went through a lot of the emotions that the average parent would go through when they're told that something is wrong. And we had to fine tune it over time to get it right.
Thanks so much for mentioning that. I think that is so critical because the worst sensation you have as a parent is watching your child struggle and feeling helpless, like there's nothing that you can do, or sometimes equally as bad that there is something you can do, but you can't get to it, right? Either because they are rejecting it or it's not available or anything else. So I really appreciate you talking about literally decades of getting to this place, trial and error, figuring out what worked, what didn't, and really sticking with it. And also the fact that you're both very distinguished physicians, quite frankly, very well established in the community, very experienced. And so you have this additional insight and you're able to sort of play an experiment in a way that I always want to point out, this show is not meant to be medical advice. This is educational. Whether your child struggles with a condition like autism or whatever it is, whatever you are doing, dietary change, et cetera, medication should always be done in consultation with your healthcare practitioner. I always want to say that. I know there are lots of people out there who are frustrated because their medical practitioner doesn't seem interested in anything other than medication. And I want to advise you to just keep trying to have that conversation, make it a dialogue, not a monologue, and really try and open their eyes, bring them research, et cetera, because it's not medication or diet. It's both, right? It's all the tools in our toolbox. So getting back to diet and tools in your toolbox, you change a diet primarily focusing on three things: on dairy, gluten, and phenols, which are, a phytonutrient that are in things like berries and chocolate, et cetera. Was it the gut in terms of the stools that started to improve first, or the skin? And then where was this sort of cognition in all of this, in terms of his joint attention and things like that? What was the sequence?
It was the gut. I would know he's getting better when, again, he was autistic, so he stayed in diapers and pull-ups a lot longer than a neurotypical child. But when we would see normal production of stool, relatively normal smell, and a more regularity of the bowel movements, that's how I knew he was starting to get better. The skin didn't clear up for many more years. In fact, I would say it was only about 4 or 5 years ago, that his eczema almost completely cleared up. So he was already 15. And remember, we got a diagnosis when he was 3. So that's a 12-year. So I know some people listening to this and like, oh my God, I'm not going to make it 12 years. You're going to make it. You just have to stay in the hunt, stay in the game, and work with your child. The child wants to get better. And once you also engage that child and try to explain to them what you're trying to do, autistic kids have a high level of intelligence. A lot of them do. In fact, some of them are genius level intelligence. And if you can even talk scientific terms to them, and they will begin to work with you to try and get better, because they want to get better. They want to feel better.
That's such a great point. And I want to, again, just really emphasize this point about time, that depending on what is going on in the rest of the body, your son was dealing with systemic inflammation. He was dealing with severe issues with his skin, as well as a neuroinflammation in the brain, and took a really long time to heal. But you can see different stages and clues like the stool normalizing, even if it is not associated with a dramatic improvement in behavior. It's still so important, so relevant. So I really encourage people, when it comes to their own health, to their children's health, to be medical detectives. I was that parent who was trying to go in and take a peek at my daughter's stool and sniffing her and smelling her. And she was like, "What is wrong with you? Get up off me." But these are important things. What our kids' bowel movements look like and smell like, and whether they're regular or not. These are things we have to pay attention to. This is not just stuff to be flushed away and forgotten about. And I'll tell you, sometimes I'm in a public restroom and somebody else is in the restroom and I smell what's going on, and I literally want to give them my card through the door and say, "You have got to call me, because something is terribly wrong. This is not supposed to smell like this." So we, again, have to use all the tools in our toolbox, and looking at what comes out is incredibly important. What comes out is a reflection of what is going on in the gut. And it's such an important thing to examine. And unfortunately, we tend to just flush that away. When we come back, we're going to be talking about the skyrocketing incidence and prevalence of diseases like autism spectrum disorder, and some connections between, again, the gut and the brain in some of these disorders. It is not an exaggeration to say that we are seeing a virtual epidemic of conditions like autism spectrum disorder, and on the other end of the age scale, Alzheimer's, Lewy body dementia, Parkinson's, etc. Something terrible is going on in our bodies. And even though I am singularly focused on the connection between our brain and our gut and our immune system and our gut, clearly these diseases are multifactorial. It's not a straight line. We can't say there are abnormalities in the microbiome or maternal infections when the baby's in utero, and this is why this is happening. It's a complex mix of genetic predisposition, environmental exposure, some of which we're not even aware of. It's hard to protect our kids from something we're not even aware that they're being exposed to, medication side effect, diet, lifestyle, exposure to nature, soil, etc. There's so much that goes into it. But I always say, why not start with the gut? It's right in the center of your body. It's an engine that's feeding all these other organs, including the brain. it's a great place to start. When we look at some of these figures, the CDC conservative estimate 1 in 60 children. In some parts of the country, it's as low as 1 in 19, it's 1 in 32 in others. And what's clear is that it's getting more and more common. Can you give us your thoughts on why you think this is happening?
Needless to say, it's a controversial issue. What we do see is the prevalence is really just going up. It's skyrocketing. It has not yet plateaued. We're seeing a lot of, especially male children, having issues and diagnoses with ADHD or even frank ASD, which is autism spectrum condition. We could spend a whole podcast on the etiology or the origins of it all. But what we do know is that it's very prevalent, and parents get thrust into a situation where they go to caregivers looking for advice, and there are different ways of approaching it.
Two of the things I want to really focus on is the idea that our kids are over-medicated and they're undernourished. And the same is true. It's true in childhood. It's true throughout adulthood and later in life. Our elderly folks are also over-medicated and undernourished. And I'm a conventionally trained doctor like you. I'm grateful for the pharmaceutical industry. We have lived longer and better because of things like antibiotics and anti-epileptics and antidepressants, etc. But our kids are on a ridiculous amount of medication. And I worry, what is it doing to their gut? What is it doing to their brain? All of these things. So the approach always, just like the diseases are multifactorial and complex, the approach is multifactorial and complex. There are families out there who have had incredible results from medication, and that is wonderful. But again, why not also consider what's going on in the gut? Because improving the diet in a way you're describing, getting rid of ultra-processed foods that often contain gluten and dairy and sugar, that's only going to make you healthier. That is, we're not saying eat coconut macaroons and this is going to solve what ails you. So for anyone, whether you're dealing with a child on the spectrum or whether you have a relatively healthy child, but you think they could be healthier, or maybe they're showing some behavioral signs that are problematic, so important to consider what they're eating. And I got to tell you, as a gastroenterologist for over 3 decades, it just is stunning and appalling that so often from the medical community, nobody's paying attention to that.
With regards to that, you may remember when we were in medical school, the amount of time we spent doing complex nutrition instruction was relatively limited compared to the amount of time we spent with microbiology or virology. Pharmacology.
More time in anatomy. And in fact, our modules on nutrition were more about things like total parenteral nutrition, IV nutrition you give to a hospitalized patient. So the beautiful thing now is that people can, because of, for all the evil things that the internet is responsible for, families can research, they can connect, they can advocate for themselves in a way that's very different from what they could decades ago. So that has been, an incredible advantage of people. I mean, the average person has access to the same information that I have access to as a physician. They may not be able to interpret it quite the same way. And that's another important point because there's a lot of snake oil out there for all of these conditions. So it's really important that you are getting your information from legitimate sources, that you're looking at data from clinical trials that are peer-reviewed, and you're not on somebody's website buying a bunch of supplements that they claim are going to, cure one ailment or another. First of all, I want to thank you again for being here on a Sunday afternoon, taking time away from your family to share this with me. You are literally one of the first guests, other than I can't count having my husband in here under duress to talk about his eczema as a guest. Not that I didn't appreciate it, but there was a little bit of pressure applied. But I literally texted you yesterday and said, I'm scared to ask, but would you be willing to come on the Gutless podcast and talk about your experience with your son? And you said absolutely and dropped what you were doing. And 24 hours later, here you are. So I'm so grateful. And this is the goal of this podcast, is to have real conversations with real people who have real struggles and have advice and wisdom to share. We are not about selling snake oil. We are about really promoting understanding about what's going on in the gut, how it can affect the rest of your body. So I'm just really so grateful that you joined us. And I want to close by asking you, of all the things that you've done, and you've done a lot of different things. You've done the therapy. I know your son rides horses and is outside a lot. He's a swimmer. By the way, he is a stunningly handsome boy, as are all your children. But I just want to point that out. He is, unbelievably handsome. But of all the things that you've done, what do you think has helped him the most?
Love. Love has helped him the most. I learned so much about myself with this situation. And I've only always wanted a family since I was a little boy. And I was given a situation where I had to look in the mirror and answer a question: who are you and what do you believe? And are you going to love your children unconditionally and fully, and as far as you can take it, the physical stress of your own body and, maintaining your career and your life? So the most important thing was loving him. And I continue to do that. And of course, we're working with him every step of the way. We involve him in every decision we make. And he's grateful. And he told me that. He can type to communicate. He doesn't use verbal language. So we're a team. And I'm his brother. And he is my brother. And that's the way it is.
I want to leave you with 3 takeaways about the gut-brain connection when it comes to autism spectrum disorder. Number 1, multiple scientific studies have made a connection between the gut microbiome and the brain in autism. Although the line connecting the two is not a straight one, there's really nothing to be lost and potentially a lot to be gained from changing the diet in a way that can improve the diversity and the composition of the gut microbiome. Number 2, bowel movements can be an important window into what's going on in the gut in autism. Stool consistency, odor, and regularity are all important clues. And number 3, be patient. As we heard from our incredible guest today, it may take years after changing the diet for improvements in cognitive function to manifest. So that's it for this episode of the Gut Bliss podcast on autism spectrum disorder and the gut. A huge thank you again to my guest. We so appreciate everything you shared with us today, especially the love. Coming up next week on the Gut Bliss podcast, my top 10 list for things that are making you bloated. Go to gutbliss.com for my free 7-day microbiome reboot course. If you like what you're hearing, drop a review and hit that subscribe button. And remember, dirt, sweat, vegetables, the best prescription for a healthy gut.
The information presented in this show is not meant to be medical advice. Consult your doctor before making any decisions about your health. The patients discussed are real people, but names and identifying features have been changed to protect their privacy.